Welcome to our podcast. Today we're talking about the subject of guilt and looking at questions such as what is true guilt? If we do have false guilt, how do we manage that? Many times I speak with people and they're not feeling good, they're feeling down or discouraged, they're feeling badly about him or herself, and in dialoguing with that person they're saying, I feel guilty. I made a decision and I was feeling great about it, and I shared it with my mom, and my mom was disappointed. She didn't think it was the right decision, and now I feel badly that she's disappointed, and I just feel a lot of guilt. And that's a common feeling for a lot of people. Any thoughts about that?
First thing comes to mind is that people, just because we're human, we put expectations on one another. And we have to separate a requirement from what is an expectation. And we make a distinction, if we're really thinking clearly, between what makes us feel badly versus something that is true guilt. So that I feel badly not being able to meet your expectation, I shouldn't transfer that over to the guilt category.
So the first order of the day then is really identifying what is true guilt and what is false guilt, and then how to manage both of those. With true guilt, in a sense, we want to hold court. What is the evidence that we have done something wrong? And we want to make that objective. So what I mean by that is anybody that would do what I've done would be wrong. They would be guilty. They've made a mistake. They've been selfish. They've broken a law. It's objectively wrong. And then it's a matter of what do we do with that? It starts by owning it. Lots of times people make mistakes and it takes them a while to catch up with the responsibility of it. There can be defensiveness, projecting things onto other people. But when we truly own it, then we can confess that, we can seek God's forgiveness, we can go to the person we've offended or hurt in some way by the actions that we've taken, we can seek forgiveness, make amends, and sometimes there are consequences, and sometimes big consequences, and those are tough, but God does promise to use those for our good, and we typically learn from those. Any additional thoughts on that?
I think the framework from what you've said has 3 points that, again, Francis Schaeffer has really emphasized. One is that God forgives. We confess, we take care of business if we've hurt another person, asking for their forgiveness in addition to that of God. And forgiveness is complete from God's perspective. The second thing is he forgets. That is, he puts it behind himself. And we as humans tend to re-accuse ourselves sometimes, or others may accuse us when in fact we've taken care of business. So I might say, if you've offended me, well, okay, I forgive you, but I'm not going to forget. Even if I don't say that second part, that might be where my heart is. And from God's perspective, that's not fair. God forgives completely. He puts it behind him, and then he brings us to an experience of being clean. Though your sins be as scarlet, they be made white as snow. That Isaiah phrase, just a beautiful phrase.
So we can have real freedom from guilt when we've gone through those steps and taken care of business. Now, that doesn't mean, as you're suggesting, that everybody else will. Sometimes when we've made a mistake, we have done something we shouldn't have, we do ask for forgiveness, and someone may grant it, but they might not. But they may never want to see us again. They may not want us to be part of their life, and that feels badly, and it can almost accuse us. And we have to work through that ourselves, because someone's struggling to receive us back or to forgive that sin doesn't mean that we should carry that until they are ready. They may or may not ever be ready. And so that brings to light the whole idea of who are we letting into our inner circle, so to speak. If it's people who hold things against us, people who continually criticize and accuse because of things we've done, we don't really want them to be on that inner circle. They're not really good for us, and they want to keep us under that oppression. If someone has struggling to forgive us, to forget something, and we've taken care of business, it is now his or her problem. It's not our problem anymore. So in a sense, hold court, see what you've done, take care of business, and that whole idea of false guilt comes up. If that objective measure of looking at what we've done and it would be wrong for all people doesn't hold true, and we've identified we feel guilty because we have not met someone's expectations, because someone says we've done something wrong, how do you think we should best manage that? It's not true guilt, it's false guilt.
Again, Francis Schaeffer comes to mind, and he talks about being falsely accused by ourselves, not just to mention, not just others. And he said, when your conscience lies to you, you need to kick it across the street.
Mm-hmm.
So this very compassionate man, Francis Schaeffer, making some very strong words about how we're to handle false guilt within ourselves. And then I think of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the physician who became a pastor theologian. And in his thinking, he has said, King David in the Old Testament didn't listen to himself, he talked to himself. And how did he talk to himself? From God's perspective, looking at himself through God's eyes, so to speak, because of the teaching of God.
So all that is bringing to mind the whole idea of our feelings are real, but our feelings can lie to us. And so we want to be really careful. What is the truth? And are we taking the time to know that and internalize it? And we do want to remind ourselves that all of this is a process. It doesn't always happen overnight, especially if we have done something wrong. It is true guilt. Working through that, seeking forgiveness, and then forgiving ourselves, and then working through the consequences. Sometimes that's a very extended period of time in our lives. And so the things that we're talking about, they're not always quick, and they're not always fair either. And so that can be a challenge when we're dealing with someone who's falsely accusing us or who won't forgive us, or we feel we've been suffered consequences that are unjust. But the goal in all of that, I think, is to continue to work through it, to trust God, and really allow Him to use it for good, because these negative experiences, when they're occurring, as painful and difficult as they can be, we learn from them, and we become more mature people, more responsible people, if we allow God to use that in our lives. If we don't, then we become angry, bitter people.
Yes. If guilt is real, God does not give us the assignment to punish ourselves. That is to be out of the picture. So I think of an anecdote from years past. Son Matthew, now in his 50s, he was 4 years old. He's in the living room. I'm across the room, and I look across, and he's pinching himself. I said, Matthew, why are you pinching yourself? He said, because I hurt David. David, as we know, is a little bit older brother. And I said, Matthew, let's talk about this. Went to another room, and I sat down as he stood, and so we're eye to eye. And I took him through the gospel, as I had before, but not in the context of feeling guilty and having done something wrong. And so it didn't make as much sense back then. Reality hadn't set in. And I said to him, after sharing the gospel again, and saying, okay, yeah, you need to say to God, I asked for forgiveness, I was wrong. Do the same to David, your brother. And I said, Matthew, once God has forgiven you, you're to forgive yourself. He got this ear-to-ear grin and turned his head side to side and said, Dad, no one ever told me that in my whole life. Mm-hmm. Again, because this is in the context of him being guilty, and the gospel really made sense, even to such a little person.
Yes, and that brings to mind again the whole idea of when we've gone through all of that, maybe the last step is really learning to forgive ourselves as well.
Absolutely.
We do not want to carry that baggage around, and there's an expression, if we're in that place, unable to forgive ourselves, isn't it a form of arrogance, that the blood of Christ was not sufficient to cover our sin? And so that's pretty convicting.
Yes.
Well, thanks for tuning in. We hope this has helped you understand a little bit more about guilt, what is true guilt, what is false guilt, and what to do with each.